The Zen monk Hakuin, who lived mostly in the 18th century, and who I really like, he's a very interesting guy and powerful spiritual teacher, had some very choice and excruciating words for certain sects of Zen monks who he thought were prevalent during his time. And these sects of Zen monks, according to him, basically preached against any kind of verbal teaching. They said, oh, words are basically completely and only misleading, and that all there is to be done is nothing. Sounds a lot like certain of the so-called Neo-Advaita teachers of today, in fact. And what Hakuin said is, these teachers and their students are basically indistinguishable. They sort of sit there like lumps, and they don't recognize that when they pretend to be quote-unquote doing nothing by sort of dispersing their mind of thought, supposedly, they are in fact actually doing a great deal. Their minds are active whether they recognize it or not. And therefore, he said, it's important that the sacred words, which in Zen would be like the koans, for example, and in other traditions like Hinduism would be various scriptural teachings, could be very, very short. The so-called Mahavakyas like Tattvamasi, that you are, those kinds of ideas, verbal ideas, they are important, that the mind must concentrate on them one way or the other so as to break into what he called kensho, which is sort of insight into one's true nature. Kensho is that sudden aha moment, also known, I think, in Zen or Buddhism generally as satori, and I would call them insights or glimpses. But it is that sort of moment of getting it. Now, that doesn't mean it's the end of the story, because once one has quote-unquote gotten it, unless the mind is very pure, one slips back. And then you have to undergo the process to get it again, and then slowly change the mind till the getting it has been gotten to the point where it can never be ungotten, or it's recognized permanently that there was no getting to be gotten in the first place, if you want to go down that route. But what I want to comment on is this notion of doing nothing and what I call surrender in my elaboration of Ramana Maharshi's teachings, and how that intersects with what Hakuin is saying in terms of kensho and words and insights. Is surrender merely that sitting like a lump type idea? Is that what I'm recommending? Is that what Ramana Maharshi is recommending? And the answer is no. Though surrender is about relaxation, it is also in itself a kind of doing. It's a doing other than the usual habit. The usual habit is getting involved in thoughts, being carried away by them, grasping after desires and avoidance of fears. In contrast to that, true surrender is not merely doing nothing. It is actively avoiding all of those things. And the key point is there is an activity in that. It is a staying awake, a staying vigilant, and watching, not thoughts for their own sake. It's not about watching the thoughts to watch them. It's about watching them so that one does not get involved in them, so that one can turn one's attention away and relax. That's what surrender is. And then it goes one step deeper, because when one relaxes, if one relaxes deeply enough, there seems to be a quietness of mind, but that quietness of mind is not the end of the story. Anything which comes and goes, any state of mind which can be entered, can be exited, any such state is not the goal. The goal is something which cannot go and therefore never came. So surrender recognizes that even a state of a relatively quiet mind is also a thought. It's merely a subtler thought. And that this state too must be recognized to be a thought and must also be surrendered. That is to say, the mind must turn away from it and relax even more deeply. And when one relaxes even more deeply, one falls into another state of thought, an even quieter state of thought, perhaps, if you want to put it that way. And on it goes. And in that continuous motion of ignoring more and more and more, of relaxing more and more and more, of continuously maintaining a vigilance so that one is not paying attention to any thoughts except the thought of surrender, in that quietness which is continuously being created and recreated and recreated and recreated, in that temporary space which is vigilantly held open through the profound action of relaxation, one attempts to ask, who is surrendering? Or, to put it another way, to surrender the surrenderer. But how does one surrender the surrenderer? Where is the surrenderer to be found? How does one ignore the surrenderer? How does one relax away from the surrenderer? It's not merely by just dropping everything and not keeping up awakeness or vigilance. Why? That would simply return you to the original state of distraction, which is the state of a non-seeker. The non-seeker also puts in no effort towards seeking. They get wrapped up in all kinds of thoughts. They put no effort towards seeking. Surrender is putting in effort to counter that habit, to counter that pattern. So it's a very specific kind of effort. It's an effort to avoid the usual kind of effort. It's a continuous effort to relax deeper and deeper, to ignore more and more, and then in that continuous space to ask the question, which is essentially like a kind of koan: how to surrender the surrenderer, or who is the surrenderer? Doesn't matter really how you put it. All the great sayings or mahavakyas of the Hindu Upanishads, like Tattvamasi, thou art that, they're all pointing to that same profound point, which is the great koan, and which cannot be solved by the mind by thinking about it or by redirecting attention, because it concerns something which isn't an idea and it isn't a thing, and it has no boundaries. It's simply right here, right now, in fact, what you really are. And a perspectival shift has to be effected that you can't force to happen, but that will happen in its own time by God's grace and by the changing structure of your mind as your mind learns to be less outward going and more inward going. As those habits change, as one learns to find greater and greater peace in the inward going surrender, effort of surrendering, so to say, attachments to the outside world, attachments to one's identity as a body and a mind weaken. Concentration on the inward process increases, and those are the conditions which create the possibility of a penetration into this great question of who is a surrenderer. And such a penetration would be kensho. And again, that kensho would not necessarily be the end of the story. One could experience that, but then usually, unless the mind is very pure, one would be dragged back. And then you'd go over it again and again and again. You wouldn't try to recapture the kensho once it slipped away. You would again go into surrender, let's say, or self-inquiry. And that would again result in, eventually, the kensho coming slightly easier the second time, ever so slightly easier than that the third time, and lasting longer and longer. And finally, the structure of the mind habits that draw it outward will be broken once and for all. But the very insight that results from that breaking will be to see that there was no mind to break in the first place. And that's the paradox, the seeker's paradox. So all of this is a long, roundabout way of saying that surrender properly understood is not what Hakuin was critiquing. What Hakuin was critiquing was a misunderstanding of surrendering, which is prevalent today, which is simply, quote-unquote, doing nothing. Proper surrender requires constant attention so that one does not fall into the patterns of non-surrender that are habitual. And that requires a continuous vigilance. That vigilance against new thought. And then to remain awake, to not simply fall into a blissful trance state either, because that is also a thought. That's the quote-unquote laya state that I talked about in one of my other videos. To remain awake, to stave off thought, to not fall into sleep or trance, and then in that space of quiet, which is continuously deepened and continuously maintained through constant vigilance, a vigilance which is about ignoring thought and relaxing ever more deeply without going to sleep. The question is asked, who is a surrenderer, or who am I? Call it what you will. That question is asked with profound intensity and effort, and obviously without any real clear knowledge of how the answer is to come about. The answer will come about when concentration has been established at a sufficient level, and then kensho will be the result. So how does one come to kensho? Well, surrender is one of the means. Surrender, properly understood, which requires not simple lack of effort, but actually continuous vigilant effort, so that one stays away from the normal patterns of the outward-going, desire-seeking, pain-avoiding mind. And as we know, surrender has nothing to do with simply sitting down and doing nothing, nor is it opposed to that particularly. It's neither any particular action, nor is it inaction per se, but it is turning away from all such decisions. Should I do this or should I do that? Turn away from that. It takes no views. Turn away from all views. Turn away from all opinions. Let the mind and body do what they will, so long as they are doing things involuntarily, automatically, meaning without you, without your conscious attention. If they can do what they need to do without your conscious attention, well and good. They're permitted to do it. But don't allow your own inner equanimity to be disrupted by getting involved. The continuous, vigilant avoidance of being involved in all thoughts, feelings, and perceptions without exception, except for the thought of surrender, a continuous deepening relaxation, a continuous deepening surrender of every thought state, including states of so-called quiet mind, including states of so-called sweetness, pleasantness, or peace. An awake vigilance that prevents one from falling asleep or going to trance state. And in that continuously recreated, continuously deepened silence, to ask how one surrenders even the surrenderer, so that there may be total effortlessness. That is the true surrender that leads to kensho, not the false, simply doing nothing kind of surrender that is misunderstood. That was misunderstood in Hakuin's time, and that is misunderstood today.